if you would like to follow along with our reading, then please look at the list on the screen now. It'll show you all the books we intend to read for the next 3 episodes. Thank you and enjoy the podcast.
Y'all ain't ready for this conversation.
Welcome, Luke and Matthew, to another exciting episode of Whiskey and Words. Tonight we have a menu that features the review of Catch-22 and also a fantastic whiskey, Cardhu Gold Reserve, single malt Scotch whiskey. So let's begin. I'm going to hand you over to Matthew, who's going to revel us with the synopsis for tonight's whiskey.
Okay, so this is a Scotch whiskey. Before I go on, everyone have a sip.
Without only one sip, or is...
Only one sip.
Okay.
Okay, now,
Ooh.
see if you can guess any of the flavours. Luke, you first.
Whiskey.
You are right. Well done. Got 1 point to Luke. Now you got it.
I'm going to go with vanilla.
Vanilla. Okay. So for the nose, it's honey tinned stone fruits.
Oh god, yes.
Stone fruits. What is that?
Well, imagine a peach. with a
Oh, that
stone
makes
in it.
sense, actually, yeah. Unstoned fruit would be an apple, I suppose, because it just has seeds, not a stone.
But it's
Is
tinned fruits.
Oh, is it tinned
Oh,
fruit?
yeah, honeyed.
Tinned fruits. Oh, honeyed as well.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever come across that. Just generally, honeyed tinned stone fruits.
Obviously,
even.
if we were connoisseurs, we would have. We'd be buying
true, yeah.
honey tinned stone fruits all the time.
Maybe
Well,
because
it's
we're not
something to
part
add
of
to the whiskey diction, isn't it?
Okay.
Sorry, next one.
Apart from that, in the nose, you've got the toffees and a hint of strawberry, with red apple and ginger coming through with a little water, whatever that means. And now onto the palate, the taste. Fairly dry with biscuity oak.
Sorry, can I stop you there? We were meant to smell water in that. That's what it was saying. With a hint of water. We're meant to be able to detect.
I mean, it's very gentle, I suppose. You know, in comparison to some of them who are very much... They emanate a scent. This
I think
is pretty neutral.
I think I smell 60% water. What about you guys?
I honestly thought you were about to snort that. That's such a deep inhale.
Would I snort 60% water? Okay, carrying on with the palate. Biscuity oak, which I'm a bit confused about, how oak can be biscuity. But carrying on, and a little bit of cinnamon, as well as some developed for those toffee and apple notes.
Okay, we should definitely go back to biscuity oak.
Okay, so imagine you're making biscuits in an oak oven. Very dangerous. But this is the sort of flavour I'm imagining.
That's the sort of flavour. So is it that way? Because then you'd get oak-infused biscuits, or is it that it's a bit of oak that you're chewing down on with, digestive sprinkled on top? Which way round are we seeing this?
Well, I think out of those two options, the most believable is an oven made out of oak. It's maybe got 2 uses until the whole thing catches fire.
No, I see it kind of... The biscuity flavour is an actual oak tree. It's you're kind of getting that nugget of oak in the taste.
Well, maybe for some of these oak tasters in the past, things were desperate and they were, eating
They
oak
were
and...
barking mad.
Okay. We'll carry on.
Please leave it.
Carrying on to the finish. Gentle oak and milk chocolate caramel digestives. Actually, whoever's written this has got an obsession with digestives. Probably Floyd has a few things to say about that.
Does it actually say milk chocolate,
Milk chocolate caramel
digestives?
Actually, I'm just going to go for the very brief description on the back of the packet rather than this. This is a lot more straight to the notes. Okay, so here it says.
What about chocolate?
Okay,
I suppose we've already covered that.
Silk maturation enriches the silky smooth Speyside character. Speyside, ever heard of that word before?
Yeah, I feel it's like a region in Scotland.
Okay, Speyside character of Cardhu with deeper flavours of dark chocolate and a ripe orchard fruit to yield a beautiful balance and depth.
Yeah, well, I mean, I
that
couldn't have
sounds-
given a better summary myself.
Yeah, that sounds a lot more sensible than gentle oak, biscuity oak, aggressive oak.
But anyway, what are people's general thoughts of this bad boy?
That's that catchphrase.
It's not a bad boy. It's more of a...
It's a very smooth boy.
Oh.
Yeah.
He's a suckler, isn't he?
It has got a bit of a... You know what? The kind of gingeriness it mentioned. I'm getting a bit of that in terms of the mouth heat and the... I don't know how to describe it.
It's
but
not
I
peaty.
am... It's definitely not
No.
peaty.
It's very smooth, but there isn't. I would say there's not that kind of rich flavour that for example, the Smokehead had.
That was beyond rich.
That was
Yeah.
very complimentary. I think he's taking payments from Smokehead.
I have never put so much ice in my whiskey as I did for Smokehead. By the time I drank it, it was probably at 15% alcoholic.
Wasn't that how Churchill drank his whiskies? You know how everybody thought he was a massive alcoholic?
And he was
But
only...
apparently, all he did was fill it up enough to cover the bottom of the glass and then would fill it with water. And it was more like a tonic. He learned it in his army days.
But didn't he have that for breakfast?
Oh, yeah. Like 50 times a day. But...
Yeah.
Yeah, how that guy kept going is a wonder to all of us.
Yeah. I remember hearing once about how... So there's this story that Churchill, every lunch, would drink a bottle of champagne. And obviously people thought that was ludicrous. But apparently it was the old imperial bottle of champagne, which is only half the size.
Okay.
And they were saying this as in, oh, so he wasn't an alcoholic, he was just casually drinking. And I thought, that's still half a bottle of champagne with lunch. That's still half a bottle of champagne more than I do with lunch.
What's interesting about the imperial units is it's not completely standardised imperial units. So, for example, in America, they talk about an imperial pint of beer. And we talk about an imperial pint of beer, but they're two different sizes.
Okay. So how did the differentiation of imperial? Was it just
Oh,
like?
you say a certain type of imperial, and they say a certain type of imperial.
Okay, so imperial is just like my country says this.
Yeah, but I think there's two standardised imperial units which are different. But that's all I know of. There might be other imperial units, but thank God a metric came along, to be quite honest.
Thank God we've got an engineer here to
Yeah.
explain it. I'm so much clearer on the topic now.
Okay, I think that ends us there very nicely. We'll pass you on to Luke, who is going to give us our book introduction.
Yes, I am. Quite a difficult one to introduce, I feel. I think everyone here would agree. So at the core of the book, it's a story about a World War II bombardier called Yossarian, who is based off the coast of Italy towards the end of the war. And the story follows essentially his descent into disillusionment with the military, with his attempts to escape the war, and with the numerous characters that he comes across in the story. But I think what makes it very difficult to summarise, and will probably make it quite challenging for us to analyse as well, is one, there's just absolute plethora of characters involved in the story. I mean, almost uncountable amount of characters, each with a lot of complexity behind them, and certainly each with their own dimensions of personality. And then also the story's chronologically a complete mess. It's very much broken up. There's no linear fashion to it. It keeps on chopping and changing back and forth. You cover the same events that have happened more than once throughout the book, from different perspectives as well. So it makes it very difficult to summarise, but I think ultimately it's a book about the much broader themes it touches on, about war, about bureaucracy, about morality, about emotive response to situations as well.
I must admit, I think this was a death task. Anyone who has to summarise this book, because it doesn't follow any linear narrative that I think I've ever been used to.
Just to give you an idea of how many characters there are, to help myself, I wrote a paragraph on each character, and I've got 7 sides of A4 here, just to show how many, not main characters, but characters who have their own chapters dedicated.
Well, I think that there's 40 chapters, isn't there? Something close to that.
Over. I think
40.
I think it's close to 50.
And I would say 90% of those chapters are named after a character that features in the book.
Yeah, exactly.
And they are the main characters. There's still sub-shoot characters who feed off those main characters. So yeah, it's I mean, that actually feeds us very nicely into our first question of the evening, and this comes from Matthew. And so his question is, why do we think Joseph Heller used the structure he did?
Okay, so just give a bit of background to this. This book is the main character is Yossarian, but of course it follows a lot of other characters. But to show maybe the descent of Yossarian into insanity, or to show his real personal feelings, for me it made sense that the book was written in first person. Now, of course, that makes it difficult to introduce a huge amount of other characters. But I want to hear what you guys have to say about this sort of structure of it being written in the third person.
I went into a bit of a deep dive on this because I think it could either be Yossarian's consciousness as the overriding narrative, or alternatively, fitting in with the book, it could almost be a bit of a godlike figure, because faith is questioned throughout the book at numerous points, and the narrator is someone who is kind of omnipresent, omniscient about the feelings of the characters, about the thoughts of the characters. And so for me, it's a really difficult one to place as to why he did it. I think he had to do it, or structure it in that way, or approach it from that way in order to, give all the characters the depth they need, and not just have it focused on Yossarian as potentially an unreliable narrator, questioning the motives of other characters. The way he does it, you understand the motives of every single character it touches upon, and that adds to their complexity. But I'm still not settled on an answer to that question, if I'm honest.
The only thing that I would add to that is, I definitely feel that the structure and the format and the way it's written adds to this sense of chaos that as the reader you are presented with. And I feel like that's something that he's purposely trying to do, is to kind of create this idea of an individual presented by bureaucracy, presented by war, presented by all of these things that really aren't in their own individual control. And by having this sporadic use of time and having this sporadic use of third person and multiple characters, and not only multiple characters but multiple characters with so many almost psychotic and different personalities, as the reader you're presented with a world that is in just constant chaos and freefall. And I feel that's, for me at least, was one of the key reasons that he adopted this kind of omnipresent structure.
So I'd agree with Luke that by creating a narrator, you effectively make an indifferent narrator, so you can present more stories fairly. But it creates a huge amount of difficulty in the fact you talked about the chaos and the fact the book goes everywhere. If it was in the first person, it would be a lot more chronological, and it would follow Yossarian's maybe walk into insanity, or not such as walk into insanity, but his story, I think, a lot better.
I think it's two separate questions: why he chose the third person narrative, and then why the structure of the book is as it is. I think with the structure, in terms of how messed up it is chronologically, and the first chapter you read about is Yossarian in the hospital with a faked liver condition that's not quite jaundice, but
which could be anything.
It's definitely moving towards jaundice in that perfect little space where it's undiagnosable but still a problem.
And this could be anywhere from late 1943 to early 1944, that first scene, couldn't it?
Well, it's shown later in the book that chronologically it happens more towards the middle of events. It's whilst he's been there a little while, a lot of things have happened to him, and it's something you come back to later in the book. But I think I actually watched an interview with Heller about the chronology of the book, why he mixed it up, and it's a big reason why it's considered postmodernist, if we want to call it that.
No. That's always a very dangerous.
What does it mean? Nobody knows.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
But he had quite an interesting take on it. His answers were a bit vague as well, to be honest, considering he wrote the book. But one of the points he made is that he thinks a more linear story is more orientated towards making a book pleasurable to read. It makes it a much more enjoyable experience, a linear story. It, has the typical dramatic sequences leading to a catharsis or whatever it may be. But by chopping and changing, you create a lot more turbulence and emotions. And from his perspective, he said he thought that pleasure is only one facet of the emotional spectrum that people should experience whilst reading a book. They should experience frustration, confusion, disgust.
This is the type of guy who gives Shakespeare to 8-year-olds.
I don't think so, no, because Shakespeare follows quite a linear pattern as well, generally.
But
because his was theatre, it had to make sense in the sequence, generally.
To make it more challenging makes it more rewarding.
I think it's mixing a lot of emotions into one. And I think something else he said that was quite interesting is he wanted to create this feeling that the past events were happening simultaneously to current events. And so it was this idea of history repeating itself, of, even though the deja vu has been had, it's still going to happen again.
The book does do that very well, that you feel that Yossarian is in this loop that keeps going on and keeps getting worse, and you have more and more sympathy for him deteriorating.
Well, one thing I feel that the book does well, and I think Luke touched upon it with the idea of having this frustration, having this heroism, having all of these angst, it's very symbolic with your own existence. Your own existence doesn't follow a linear route. It's always interchanged with things from the past floating up into the current, relationships and ideas. And I feel like he's very much just trying to give a very real depiction of what life is like. And life isn't a fairy tale story about a World War II veteran killing everyone. It's actually much more about the nuances of the mess officer, the nuances of the hierarchy that you're in, the past, previous experiences, and it's all of that world interchanging. And I think what is another thing that should be pointed out, it's a hell of an ambitious novel to write as your first novel. I mean, this is Joseph Heller's first novel, I believe. And, to really take on board 40 different characters, it's basically ripping up the rule book of how you write a classic novel and saying, here you have it, which I think hats off to the guy.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's so clever how so many of the things we're going to talk about and that we have talked about all weave into one. It all weaves into this mesh, which I think is what makes it quite hard to untangle. And, it's a fact where even the order of the book means that events get talked about twice. But then that's a common theme. Everything gets discussed twice. You have the man who sees things twice. And it's that feeling of repetition.
That's one of the reasons I found the book easier to read in the second half. Is because of this repetition of events. Even though it was going all over the place, it somehow started to make more sense. Like when, he's talking about that. And you start to put that chronological order together in your head. But the first half, you're a bit lost sometimes, the timings. The only real indication you get of the timings is, in the first half, is the bomber command, the officers who are in charge of him. They always give a certain amount of missions you have to fly before you can fly home, and that number keeps going up. And for me, during the first half, that was my greatest indication of time going forward, was that number.
One thing that the book really writes about is the multiple concepts of déjà vu. And, the chaplain, I think, goes into quite a lot of detail in actually explaining to the audience. And I personally, when I first read it, I never really understood the significance. But I think when you start bringing it back to the fact that events repeat twice, and I think Luke touched upon it with the idea that history is almost a repeat and relationships are on a repeat, but maybe you guys have a better idea of that.
No, I'd agree. I think it's all about, to me, it's the same reason why so much of the book is also circular as well. You know, characters constantly are using circular logic, are using circular reasoning, are having circular discussions, and it's not just a broad overriding theme. It pervades every small interaction that happens in the book. You know, there's a part where he's talking to a prostitute in Paris, and he's asking her to marry him, and she's saying, "I can't marry you because you're mad." "Oh, why am I mad?" "Because you want to marry me." And that happens throughout the book constantly. And so it is this feeling that everything's a circle, that it's almost fatalistic, that it's
a wave coming in.
Yeah, that it's predetermined, that things will repeat, that there is nothing you can do about it either, because there's so many situations where Yossarian, as we learn through the very discombobulated chronology of the book, has experienced in different forms before, but yet kind of commits the same actions or is surprised that it's happening again. And so I think it really begs this question about, you know, is there any choice there? Is destiny in any of their hands?
It almost felt that he was purposely writing it to make that there was no linear choice. You know, it was a book that was put out there that there wasn't a right, there wasn't a wrong. There's just series of spontaneous events, and I don't know. I never felt there was purposely not a succinct narrative that you could say, well, things repeat twice because, you know, this is how wars generate, or this is how religion is. It was almost just, that's just craziness, and that's insanity, and that's what life is.
Do you think that circular nature was to encourage this feel of frustration? Because I felt it.
I felt it a lot. I felt it. The scene or section I felt it the most was when there's a character called Dr. Danica.
Yeah.
Who's obviously one of the military doctors, and by mistake he is declared dead by the military because they misidentify him as another individual in a plane who was shot down, another doctor.
In order for him to get extra pay, he has to say he does a certain amount of flight hours, and that's why he faked he was on that plane that crashed.
It's why he was... I think they say he was normally be on that plane, but in that instance he wasn't, and just wasn't documented. It's this kind of point about bureaucracy that I'm sure we'll touch upon, that his name was down on the roster but he didn't go.
Well, I think he always lied, so he never wanted to do any flights, so he always got the captains to put his name on the roster. But anyway, sorry.
But it's that whole section where he's declared dead because of that, and even though he is obviously walking around still alive, people are saying to him, "Oh, you're dead, by the way." Very, very odd to see you because you're dead. And letters get sent to his wife. They ignore his letters that are sent in return. Every letter she sends him is marked, you know, cannot send, killed in action, even though he's there on the base. And superior officers, when he tries to go and reason with them, telling him, "Oh, if you turn up here again, I'll cremate you because you're a dead man." And it's that kind of, that section in particular, I just felt his frustration so much.
I feel that there's this juxtaposition within the whole narration, is you put an individual in a bureaucracy that doesn't care about you, is fighting a war effort that there is no central command, it's all completely led by random and non-appreciative logic, and you've got this individual kind of stuck in this massive war bureaucracy, and everything that, you know, he makes the obvious he makes the observation, you know, is the enemy the Germans, or is it the enemy the Americans who are sending me in to die? But, you know, both have the same object, but, you know, one is alleged the enemy and one is alleged the allies.
The only suggestion I can give in that section is they're all saying "you're dead" as giving him a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. is you're out of military service.
No, because he can't go home though.
Exactly,
Because
and that's why it's too bizarre.
Because his wife presumes he's dead, and she starts receiving all these financial benefits from him being dead, and he can't prove he's alive. It talks about how he can't even claim food rations or clothing, surplus. He has to rely on other people to maintain just his basic life because he no longer exists in the system. But I think it is, that's what's quite clever about the book, and again, bring it back round to that kind of circular reasoning where there is no escape, and it's the whole title of the book, and the title of the book and the narrative that derived from that created its own whole paradoxical situation that's now entered common parlance, basically.
This is a question that Luke raised, and I think you touched on it there, with this whole circular narrative, and I'm just going to open it to discussion. What do we quintessentially think that circular narrative device is used for? And as this is Luke's question, I'll let you go first.
So I think it's to create that feeling of frustration, of inescapability. The fact Catch-22 is a paradox where there is no escape. It's contradictory rules against each other. Either way you go, damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I think it creates that sensation of hopelessness in the book, and also that feeling that there is no individual determination either. No matter what the individual does, it doesn't matter. He can fly more missions, he can pretend to be insane, he can actually go insane, but it never matters because there's always a Catch-22 around it, which ensures he does what somebody, an unknown power, wants him to do, whoever he is or whatever he's doing. So I think for me that he could have just left it as a broad sense of the Catch-22 or the circular, but by bringing it into every conversation, he really draws out that this is not just an insanity that exists in particular situations, but everywhere in a way.
For me, there's 3 reasons why the circular conversations go on. First of all, it's funny. A lot of them are quite funny. Someone reasoning why, for example, they walk around with crab apples in their mouth, and his reasoning is because he wants to prove that he doesn't have conkers in his mouth. There's just bizarre reasoning that goes round. I won't give the whole conversation because it'll take too long. But there's comedy. One of the other reasons is boredom. Circular reasoning and things happening again and again and again, that signifies boredom, things not changing. And this whole book, it's all set, most of it is just set on one island. They never change bases at all. Mm-hmm. And my final reason, I've forgotten. Carry on.
I think that you just made me think about how a lot of it, as you say, it's humorous. It's used in a very dark, comedic way a lot of the time. But what he does very well is actually pluck on the strings of reality with them as well. So you'll have a laugh about it, but then once you sit back and think about it, you realise how relatable it is. So there's one of the characters, I think it's Orr, who loves shooting or loves skeet shooting because he hates it, and so it makes the time go slower because he's bored. And then that's that kind of circular reason. He loves it because he hates it because he loves it.
I think it's Dunbar.
It's a Dunbar, yeah. And it's a very humorous kind of skewering of logic. But then you sit back and you think about how how fleeting life can be, and how true that statement is, that if you're doing a lot or being excited, time does fly. And maybe there's some justification in his thought process that if you want to prolong life, if you're that desperate for it, why not strive after boredom? And so there's quite a lot of deep intricacies in these hilarious circular concepts he creates.
I've just thought my third reason, it's a pretty damn obvious one. Circular conversations is a sign of insanity. Someone who repeats himself again and again and again. It's what we typically think of an insane person.
Which is ironic, because I don't think you ever hear, or it's never mentioned, Yossarian entering into his own circular conversation. He's always dealing with other people's.
But it was almost, taking this maybe to a more schizophrenic, and it does feel, there's so many characters who are, I think the way that you'd have to describe it is they're almost shouting over each other. There is no discussion, it's just, people like Hungry Joe or anybody comes in, it's almost just a throng of narrative, and that you have some pages which are just constant conversations of, you said this, no, but I can't hear you, and, it goes back and back, and
what I saw in the book is those circular conversations typically happen with 3 characters. So there's 2 characters in the circular conversation, and when you think it's going to reach some normality, a 3rd character kicks in and then creates the unreality again, and it's nearly always 3 characters.
But again, going back to, I think I agree with all of you, when I think there's this pent-up frustration, but it's just such an unusual, I don't think I've ever read a book that's used, I suppose Catch-22, it literally centres on this one paradox, and it just kind of fills up every page. But it feels like it's almost, when I read it, I felt it was more of a comedian coming with skits, each time kind of thinking of a character and then enlarging that character and then filling it with more. To touch upon this book, it is hilarious. There is so much depth to the humour. I think that's probably why, because I probably haven't read many comedy books, and so maybe this type of satire is quite unfamiliar to me, but in that sense it was very interesting, and in that it did bring out such a different spiel.
Yeah, and I think you're completely right in saying it doesn't feel like a common thought sort of comedy in literature, because I've never come across this kind of unique form of dark humour in a book before that is so intensely woven into every element of the story. I can't think of anything comparable, which again means I give all the credence to Hella for it. Yeah, because it's not just a...
But it's a black eye, Luke hasn't read more.
So what do we think is... What do each of us feel was the funniest part of the book?
For me, it still has to go up to... I'll give more of the crab apple story. So, Orr, who we find actually is reasonably sane, but he's making himself a bit insane at the beginning of the book, talks always about carrying around crab apples when he was a young boy in his cheeks, to try and prove that he didn't have conkers in his cheeks. So what he used to do is he used to walk around with crab apples in his cheeks and then hold conkers in his hands to prove that he didn't have conkers in his cheeks. And he is driving Hungry Joe absolutely mad. And Hungry Joe is like, so why have you got crab apples in your cheeks? And he's like, just to prove I don't have conkers in my cheeks. And he's driving Hungry Joe, this is another character, absolutely mad. And you learn by the end of the story, he's doing this just actually for his own enjoyment, but you think he's quite insane.
For you, what was the most humorous part?
I love I think it's the opening, maybe 50 pages or whatever, and you get, is it Chief White Coat? Anyway, who's the Indian, Native American, who is within the squadron. And it talks about how before the war started, he was... his village and his family were constantly used as a tool by the oil companies to find new oil. So as soon as they would set up their little residence, the oil companies would come in and then start drilling for oil, and then every single time they would find new oil, and then the Native Americans move on to another patch of land, and then the oil companies would come, and then it ends with I can't remember the exact ending, but it's something like he realised that there was no more space to move because
the way he ended the story was the oil companies got so good at tracking where he was going. They used to go to the place before he got there.
Oh, yeah.
So he thought of going someplace, and the oil companies went there. And at that point, thought, I give up, I'll join the army.
That's good, isn't it? That's good. I think for me, it's... so near the beginning of the book, is it Clevenger has that military court case? It's not. I wouldn't call it a military court case, but maybe a military panel to investigate him.
Yeah, because he faints during a parade.
And there's so many funny elements to it. Like they say, oh, he was guilty, of course, because they found him guilty. Now they just needed to figure out what for. And they're constantly going back and forth. and they're saying, "Did you tell Yossarian that we could not find you guilty?" "No, sorry, I didn't." "So what did you say?" "I said you couldn't find me guilty." "So you did say it?" "No, I didn't, sir. I said you couldn't find me guilty because..." And then there's a great bit in that where the scribe, or whoever's taking minutes or whatever it is
Say the last
jotting
line.
down.
Yeah.
And the colonel says, tell me the last thing I said." And he goes, "Tell me the last thing I said." He says, "No, not that, you idiot. The last thing said." He goes, "Tell me the last thing I said." He goes, "What are you talking about?" And he's like, "Well, that was the last thing I said."
You know, that scene is the best out of the recent Catch-22 mini TV series. That is the best scene. And the TV series was directed by George Clooney, and George Clooney is Captain Scheisskopf.
Oh, really?
The guy that's
Oh,
instigating
really?
it, and it is the best scene.
Is it any
I
good,
just-
the TV series?
I feel like
it
it's
is
such
good.
a difficult book
Yeah.
to capture with a TV series.
The thing
so
that
difficult.
put me off with watching this TV series is they changed some of the deaths round. They attributed
Oh, really?
different characters, yeah, with a couple, which is a bit confusing, of course, when I was trying to watch that to help myself with the pure number of characters and putting them into my head and giving them, you know...
What was the TV series quite slapstick, or how did they go about it?
It was quite slapstick towards the beginning. No, it was slapstick pretty much the whole way
Yeah.
through. But of course, it got more serious as the missions went up.
What was the rating of it? Was it highly rated on?
No idea.
What did you think of it? Like, you know,
It was good. It was good.
It was good.
I would watch it again in a few years' time.
really? Is it just one season?
Yeah, just a 6-part mini-series.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I watched kind of clips from the film, and
Yeah, so just for the listeners, there is a film which is back from the 1970s about this.
yeah, probably
And
around
then
that
there's
time.
also a mini TV series that was done a couple of years ago.
Yeah, but the film, I don't know, because I don't know, it just didn't have that nuance that, you know, it was very slapstick. So you had, you know, planes crashing into each other, and, you know, while they're having, you know, conversations, and I don't know, it just didn't do it for me. I feel that the way the book is narrated
It's a 550-page book. Putting a 550-page book into a 2-hour film is going to be pretty difficult.
sure, but it's a 550-page book where very little happens. In the actual, if you were going to say what happened in this book, you could summarize the actual story. They stay on this military base for 3 months. It could be a very, you know, succinct summary of, or maybe not 3 months,
year.
maybe a year. Sorry,
Yeah.
and people die, but there isn't much. You know, we were talking about that it's a 550-page book where not that much goes on in terms of actual
I was talking
non-character development.
So there's the film, which is, I think it's an hour and 50-minute film, and then there's the mini TV series, which is in total will be about 4 hours. I think the mini TV series brings in most of it, but of course the film will have to leave a lot out.
But I think the length of the book does quite well in expressing a lot of the mundane situations and existence that especially maybe airmen went through, and the detachment as well. And so you reach this point where at the end of the book, or towards the end of the book, this succession of actually quite serious events happen, and quite horrifying events. Obviously he has, is it Arby? When he goes to Rome, he goes AWOL, goes to Rome to find Nately's whore's little sister. Arby rapes and murders somebody. He gets arrested. But whilst he's walking around Rome, he sees the true horrors of war on the ground, and then it's obviously put up to his big moral decision at the end as well. But that happens all quite quickly.
I love how the chapter for that is called The Eternal City. And, you know, you feel, I don't know, when I read, at least when I had that image, you know, of the Eternal City, it's kind of this very nostalgic, beautiful Rome, and then you're presented to this diabolical chaos. And then you also, it kind of reminds me of the dialogue that they had with that old man in the brothel.
Yeah.
Where, you know, he's basically saying, well, I was on the side of the Nazis when they were here. I was on the side of the Allies when they were here.
And this
and
is
it's
why
that-
the Italians will continue.
Yeah, exactly. It's that eternal city. It's like we will change allegiance to whatever flag comes before us, and no matter what the chaos or no matter what the changes that might be brought onto the people.
He, for me, the older Italian gentleman was probably one of the most interesting characters.
Most logical.
One of the most logical, but I think he obviously unveils a reality of World War II in terms of cheering for the Nazis when they came in, cheering for the Allies, because it's personally beneficial. And he talks a lot as well about what is a country. Why do you want to die for a country?
Oh,
it's nothing but lines and pieces of of little demarcations on a map, and anything worth dying for is also worth living for. So why do you want to die for it? And this comes into one of my big questions: is what does the book say about patriotism?
Well, I'm going to go back to what was the point of fighting in the Second World War. And you look at Germany, death rate 6% of the population by the end of the Second World War. UK, about 1.8. Russia, absolutely huge. But you got countries like the Netherlands, which still existed after the Second World War without such major amounts of deaths.
Netherlands was huge amounts of deaths to the male population.
To the male population?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Because they got completely ramsacked. If you think I think it was pretty hard for the Netherlands because they didn't have they wouldn't have got proper food rations. At least one story I heard from, and might be a load of rubbish, but this is from a Dutch guy, and he told me that the average height of Dutch people before the Second World War was akin to what the average height was in England, so about 5'8". But by the end of the Second World War, the height was about 6 foot. And it kept going up because they'd been left, it was very much a survival of the fittest culture. And so the people who were the biggest, did the best in this type of society. So it doesn't sound a completely rose-tinted...
I've heard
they
another...
They are the tallest people on Earth now as well. It's the tallest country on Earth is the Dutch. So it makes sense.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
It's kind of... Because if you think about it, why is Holland, a country which is so close to all of us, a good 4 inches, maybe not 4.
Well, it's obvious. When the country floods, you've got to have your head above the water.
Sorry, let's go back to Luke's question here. And again, it's throwing it out there, but what does the book say about patriotism? I think listening to Luke, and I think it shows, at least from my perspective, that patriotism isn't good for the individual person, and the only time it is good for the individual is if you're in a specific senior rank. So I think the book does a good job of highlighting the difference in perspective of your frontline soldier and your colonels, because it makes it very clear the level of treatment that is provided by the army between majors, between colonels. I mean, majors are still pretty well treated, but then you jump to the colonel level and they're having the finest dinners, and they're basically never getting to war. They're all talking about the bureaucracy of war, but never actually getting involved in actually flying the missions to die. And there's definitely this idea that patriotism only suits those people put in a certain strata of society.
I think with this question, it's really important to remember the time it was written and the context it was written in, because Joseph Heller started writing it in the late 1950s, published early 1960s.
I think it was 1961 published.
Yeah, and he himself said the book wasn't really about World War II. It was more about American society at the time, but in contrast to World War II. And so I think what you've got is obviously America after the Second World War, which was a uniquely noble war in many ways. It could be defined as good versus evil. You had fascism and the liberators. It was very clear demarcations. It could galvanize public support once America were involved. It was, even for the simplest person, very easy to understand. There was no ambiguity or greyness. It was people fighting for an honourable cause. But then by the time Heller started writing this, America then had entered into a Cold War period. It gotten involved in the Korean War. Things had become a lot murkier and a lot more ambiguous. And I think that had taken away the veil of patriotism, because patriotism was very easy to utilise in World War II when you're fighting Nazis, and Nazis are bad, they're doing terrible things, particularly with the revelations after World War II of obviously what they were doing with the Holocaust. But then you enter into something like the Korean War, and by the time this was published, Vietnam was looking like it could potentially happen, and a lot more questions start getting raised, and therefore a lot more questions about your patriotic duty start getting raised. So I think it's highlighting how, for me, in the post-war period, how much patriotism was subverted by the actions of the US government.
I would like to highlight here, the US were very against going into both the First World War and the Second World War. There was a tremendous amount of the US population who really didn't want to get involved in the Second World War. They often cited it as the European War. It was only Pearl Harbor that really changed the dynamics of patriotism. So I don't know. I still think, even from Heller, who we've got to remember was a Second World War pilot and who was based in Italy, I still think he would have had those inclinations and those thoughts, because even maybe he might have been patriotic. There surely would have been, and there was, a number of articles and press and people who would say, this is America, we're a completely different continent, and we represent America. I mean, make America great again, and all of this.
So what I'm going to put it back in context again. So Yossarian, who's the main character, is a bombardier, just like what the author was. And a bombardier's duty is they're on a B-25, or Yossarian's on a B-25 bomber, and he's the guy at the very front of the plane, and he's the guy that uses his eyepiece and he drops the bombs at the opportune time. But the reality is, of most of these Italian missions he's doing, he's dropping a few bombs on what he thinks is a German position near an Italian city or near an Italian town. So most of the time, he isn't hitting the target, or his friends aren't hitting the target. They're hitting Italian civilians. And they're not hugely affecting the war effort. For the Germans, this is not the main front. This is a secondary front. So for him, this feeling of, I am defeating the Germans, is somewhat lost. And that's why I think the patriotism has gone. It's not like the Russians fighting the Germans.
No, I disagree. And, I think genuinely, even for America, I know they came into World War II later, but once Pearl Harbor happened, that patriotic fervour really reached a fever pitch. It was like post 9/11. It was full guns blazing into war. We want to destroy someone who has personally hurt us as a nation. And so I think there was, a massive... It was jingoism. It was like pure nationalistic patriotism running through the veins of the country. And Heller himself said that Yossarian isn't based on him. He enjoyed his military service. He enjoyed what he did. He thought World War II was a great experience for him because he felt he was making a difference in the world. And I think that's the key, that he's making a comment about the way the world went after World War II in terms of that distinction between what side of the fence you're on, good or evil, just, unjust. And with that comes that question of, well, what are you fighting for? A country or an ideology or politics?
The only thing I would draw back on is the circular narrative. And I feel that you touched on, I think you are correct, in that it's a series of events repeating themselves. And I think that is his comment on history, is, the fervour or the patriotism, and then, so an empire, it begins with the idea that it needs to be patriotic in order to secure its standing in the world. And then that patriotism breeds into something much more, and it becomes more akin to capitalism in that it's trying to create a war economy that dominates the seas with, their ability to trade. I feel almost, if we kind of paralleled it to the British Empire, it's probably very similar. Britain probably started its empire through wanting to salvage its own island, with Spanish invasion and all of these other different types of attacking forces. And then, 100 years later, it's not just dominated its own little patch of water, it's now moving on to the bigger and more grander scale. And I wonder if this circular narrative is more, it's very much bringing in the ideas of history and how empires and tides, they all repeat.
I actually agree with Elliot in a way. I think he's saying... I agree with you because I think Heller would never deny the absurdity of war, no matter the war. I think probably for him and for many people, World War II glazed over that because of the distinction, but the absurdity of war persists, really. It never really makes sense. It's dysfunctional, nonsensical, never what you expect it to be.
Yeah, a fly on the wall would still find it, or an alien coming into World War II or coming into the Vietnam War would still find it a mad thing that people are going... individuals are... My dad actually told quite a funny story, and he was, grew up in Bradford and on quite a, council estate in Bradford. And he always found it quite funny that the people in the local pub, this was like 1970s, would say, what if the Russians invaded? Like, we've got to stop this. And, his perspective was like, well, what do you have that they're going to come and take? Like, you you have your, your Guinness or your pint and, your small accommodation. Do you really think the Russians are going to come and target you, or they're going to target the people who have all the money? And it's that interesting idea.
I suppose the question almost becomes, maybe I'm labouring under a bit of a misapprehension here, but is it a case where Heller thinks that patriotism in its very concept is absurd, or do you think he's making a point that patriotism is just a bit misguided in its form, and it has a purpose, but it's just not taken up the right evolution almost?
I feel he writes in a style that is morally nebulous. I mean, this is like his in some of the books he talks about how he wrote characters that are like God, he wrote characters who are like atheists, he wrote characters that are like the devil, and I feel like he purposely goes out of his way to make sure that the audience isn't presented with this is the depiction of hell, or this is the depiction of heaven, or this is everything is, this is one, it could happen, it could be like this, it could be better, it could be worse.
What I'd argue is, with his narrating type, it could be okay for example, an American soldier going into Afghanistan, where he is personally not invested. These Afghan Taliban he's fighting against have never hurt his own family or people he knows. So for those sort of conflicts, I do agree with this sort of narrative, but he's never touching, for example, Russians against Germans. That's something completely different.
No, but he does.
How is that different?
Sorry, Luke. Yossarian does do a very significant bombing of Bologna, where he wins an award, and that probably would have been very important to block that bridge in order for them to invade into Italy. So I still think they are touching on very important parts of World War II, at least from the American dimension. And this was the front they were before D-Day. This was the front that they were really pushing on. So I think the idea that I don't think Heller would have cared. He would have written the exact same. If he'd been a Russian in the Russian army, I think he would have written obviously a different novel, but I think it would have included this idea of war bureaucracy and multi-layered factors in presenting a narrative. I don't think it would have been a patriotic narrative if he'd written it from anybody else's perspective.
What I found remarkable about the novel is actually the lack of times he mentions the Germans. In fact, I don't think he ever mentions Hitler once and throughout the whole novel. Does he?
This is one for Will.
No, I don't think he does. But he does mention the Germans.
Yeah.
He does mention the Germans. But that's the whole point of Yossarian, isn't it? Where he equates the Germans' desire to kill him with
his senior
command's, insistence on him going on what he considers suicidal missions. So to him, they're equitable. The kind of, the death situations he's being put in, the responsibility shared between both sides. So that's why I feel like he never talks about them a lot, because to him there is no enemy ally. It's everyone's out to get him, whoever they are.
I think this brings us nicely to our next question, and that is Catch-22 a comic novel or a story of morality? And I think the reason I this is one of my questions, and the reason I asked this was because I feel great comedy is both funny and
and poignant.
It gives, that is what comedy really is. Some people probably like Michael McIntyre, but I just find him horrendous as a comedian because he does this very boring, middle-of-the-road comedy about nothing. And for me, that's not what comedy is about. Comedy is about touching really important political, social issues and giving a perspective on them. I feel that's what this book is so adept at doing.
For me, comedy. It's a very good... World War II, as in all wars, are very depressing. To be able to make a comedy out of it, although poignant the whole way through, hats off to him. And I mainly look at it as black comedy.
I think it's really difficult because I think so much comedy is kind of seeded in the questions about morality as well.
There were so many aspects of this that were very akin to Blackadder. In the final scene in World War One, I can't remember the name of the series, but a lot of the scenes almost were kind of word for word dialogue, in that you had majors, you had commanders who were just completely inept and hopeless, and then you had the frontline soldiers who are about to go over the trenches and die.
So what I found really interesting while just doing a bit of research on this book is I came across a YouTube video where back in the 70s maybe Heller did a interview at an Air Force base where he was interviewed by air commanders, and I mean they are just putting all the adoration on him they can. They think it's a fantastic book, but when you go down into the comments, there's so many people talking about from air military service about the characters in his book who reminded them of characters they actually came across, and the most common one was Major.
Really?
Yeah. So many of them in the comments were talking about how he was the individual that reminded them the most of officers they'd come across.
Major was the character. Major, so my apologies. Was the character I actually found the most interesting. So a bit of backdrop to Major.
It's just Major saying it.
His original name was Major. First name Major, second name Major, last name Major. And this is all due to his dad putting his first name as Major and his second name as Major. But anyways, due to a admin error, he gets the rank of Major. But he is a very timid chap who doesn't actually want this rank, and sort of does everything he can to escape it once he gets it. And successfully, he just keeps his rank going. Which it highlights two things for me. It first of all highlights the fact that you can get away in the military of being quite incompetent and continuing. But also, secondly, it highlights the fact that even though you might feel you're completely incompetent, and if you are put into a senior position, for some people they can never achieve. Like a lot of people, if you took them off the street and you said you're now a manager, some of them would take it up and actually be able to succeed.
I
but
feel
a lot of them wouldn't.
The difficulty Major really struggles with is that disconnect between he just wants to fit in and be a normal dude, and they are not allowing him to be on the same hierarchy as the common man. And I think he has a real trouble accepting that. I mean, he talks about the love that he had finally being accepted when he was just a normal rank.
He's just an academic fellow, quite a bit autistic.
And he then gets put into this specific role, and absolutely hates it because now the men think he is above them, even though and I think that's
You feel sorry for him.
Yeah, and it's kind of...
I feel sorry for him because he's just a victim of the kind of bureaucracy and dysfunctionality we all come across in life. Of course, a computer picked him out because his name was Major, but you have it in normal life where there's somebody at your company who makes a senior position just because they've been there 20 years.
I love how even the computer is having a joke.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's so bureaucratic that even the computers are like, this is great fun.
And it's due to another bureaucratic error that no one ever challenges it. Because, of course, if they start challenging rank, then they're challenging themselves, so they can never challenge it.
But then, again, there's a part of the book where, in this circular, non-logical fashion, one of the characters is talking to another who's a lower rank than him, but he's saying, just because I'm a lower rank than you doesn't mean I'm not your commanding officer. And the other chap goes, of course, sir, of course. It kind of just points out the whole redundancy of the hierarchy. You know, well, why do people have these ranks? What right do they really have? What value are they really providing?
Something I should mention is every single person on one of these bombers is technically an officer.
Interesting in the whole rank, at least as it goes into more senior echelons, is, you know, the whole actual consideration of the war, the whole consideration of the men is completely lost. The only thing they're chasing is rank. And, you know, I think that's a solid criticism on hierarchy, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's what I mean. It's about, he just completely subverts that concept of status being deserved. You know,
yeah.
Which I think back when he was writing it would have been much more profound. Now, the modern generation realises it more and more. You know, we talk about how the CEOs don't do what they should be doing or acting how they should be doing to justify their position. But back in the 60s and the 50s,
you didn't challenge it.
It was assumed that because someone had a particular position, they deserved it.
And we're back. That was a nice interlude. So we'll go to the very important question of the evening. How is the whiskey being received?
Well, the winky is very small, but the whiskey's making me feel better about it.
For myself, it's a very easygoing whiskey. I've enjoyed drinking it throughout the night, but for me, it's not very characteristic. It's quite bland, actually.
Yeah, there's no defining characteristic. I mean, always bring it back to the smoker, because that really is where our, you know, paradigm shifts to. And, you know, the smokehead is one, as we keep talking about, it really left a long-lasting impression. However, if you had the choice of drinking this for a casual, you know, whiskey at the bar, would you prefer this or the smokehead?
This one.
Yeah, definitely this. I mean, to me, this has got a little bit of bitterness, but also a little bit of sweetness, and it's still quite smooth. The smokehead was just horrific.
Overpowering.
It was like we were amateur boxers, and suddenly we got a fight with Mike Tyson.
Yeah,
that was how I felt drinking the smokehead.
And my hands were tied up. Won't make much difference.
Yeah.
But I think for this, I don't know how to describe it, but it's got almost a little bit too much sickliness to it for me.
Yeah, it doesn't feel. Again,
it's not punchy in a certain way.
Yeah, it's non-definitive, isn't it? It's kind of your average table wine. If you bring it to a wine context, it doesn't. There's nothing that you don't get the taste and you think, wow, that's really distinct. It's just like a nice, easygoing, not too much.
We compare it to what was for me the best whiskey we've had, the Penderyn. That had, and again, I'm talking about it in a very unsophisticated way, and the fact I don't know anything about whiskey.
Jeepers. I mean, how dare you, Luke? You betrayed our limited knowledge on nothing.
I mean, we went to that whiskey college for 3 years.
It was 15 for me. I never passed.
But I went to it when you were young at school.
I'm 75 now, Matthias. At least that's my liver's age.
I moved on to the brandy course now. Yeah. But I feel like that had a richness and a depth and something a bit more, I don't want to say creamy because that's got weird connotations about it, but the smoothness with that felt a lot more satisfying, where the smoothness feels a lot more bland.
You know what we should do? We should when we get the mass amounts of audience and revenue, we should round up all the whiskies that we've consumed and then do a taste off. That would be I mean, there's only been 4 so far, so
yeah, but we need to drink all 4 bottles.
Yeah.
We're still talking 70 centilitres per bottle.
Yeah, well, we're talking about the Christmas edition. Okay, Moving swiftly on to our next question of the evening. And this is, discuss how the novel can be described as a struggle between the individual and an institution. Does anyone want to kick us off on this one?
Very, very big question.
Oh, it's a huge question. I think it's perfectly dropped just before another tasting moment. Just so the big ideas can ruminate in the very abstract skulls of ours.
I feel like I'm hitting a flow with this question. I think it really ties into the idea of what is predetermined and what is up to individual choice. And I think throughout the entire novel, it's clear that all of the large choices, or even the small choices, are out of the hands of the characters. And even the things that seem to happen by hapchance are, in a way, dictated by some higher power, by the choices they make, by the barriers they put in place. And that's why, at the end, the decision Yossarian makes to reject the offer he's made to become a major, to go home, is such a big decision. It's why it concludes the book very well.
Can you give a bit more backdrop to this, just so the listeners know?
So, after Yossarian is arrested in Rome for going AWOL, he is offered a ticket home on the basis that when he gets home, he speaks only positively of the military, that he basically becomes this PR vocal front. And in exchange, he obviously gets the chance to go home, but he will be made a major, and he will be one of the boys. Essentially, he'll be part of the inner circle, and he won't have to put himself in danger anymore. And initially, he accepts the offer, despite some deliberation. He accepts it quite gladly. Immediately afterwards, he is grievously injured by a woman who he comes across earlier in the novel, Nately's whore, and then in hospital afterwards he makes the decision to refuse the offer. And it's the first time where his personal choice actually has implications, where he can actually decide his own fate.
Yeah, so before his personal choices were, I'm going to hospitalise myself. They're not directly going against authority, and this is the first time he's really...
But the thing is, even when he makes the choice to hospitalise himself, he's always brought back to the front.
Yeah.
There is never an escape. There is never anything he can do which...
He's delaying.
Which kind of fulfills his personal desire. He has no avenue to fulfill his personal desire or, his personal objective. And that's the first time in the book he does, almost, or that he can. And so for me, the entire book up to that point is about how all the power is out of his hands, how he is ostracised from any decision making about his own life, and he is living this kind of fatalistic destiny almost.
With this question, I think it really needs to be broken down to us as the reader. Who do we conceptualise as the individual, and who do we conceptualise as the institution? And that, I think, is a really interesting question, because ultimately all of them are individuals, but we form a very much a linear narrative that us as the individual, at least for me reading it, was always the officers or the lowest class, and the institution was represented by Colonel Kafka or Colonel Korn. And, because there's no real... You wouldn't say that there is a disconnect between the people who administer decisions and a governing body. It's very much the individuals themselves. And it's interesting that he makes this disconnect just through hierarchy and personal experience, rather than actually there being a bureaucracy on top of individuals. It's very much the individual interaction.
A very simplistic way of separating them is the institution and the people that are not flying the planes. The people who are flying the planes are the individuals.
But the institution and the individuals are the same. That's the interesting question. It's just how hierarchy and bureaucracy manipulate individuals gives them a completely different role within the institution.
Yeah, which is something that Major can never do.
Well, I mean, he's given a role, but he's the quintessential example of this. He's somebody who's aligned with the lower officers, and yet the institution has made him who he is, just through sporadic force.
I think to kind of codify this a little bit, everyone back then and now, to some degree, exists as part of an institution in some form or another. Your work is some kind of institution. The government is some kind of institution. Your family is some kind of institution. But the question is, how much personal choice do you have within that institution?
Yeah, no, I think that is... When we look at many other books, everyone comes from different institutions. It would be the standard narrative. You have religion, you have politics, you have all of these different quintessential institutions. Well, we are very much presented with a one mould, or maybe it is a narrative onto I don't know, maybe that's a bit abstract, but the chaplain is a military man who's synonymous with religion. You have colonels who are synonymous with hierarchy. You have Milo, who Milo needs a bit of describing, but he would be what you would personify as capitalism and trade and market forces. And you have all of them under this umbrella organisation of the military. But I still think it's interesting to look at the fact that where does the individual, and from the British tradition, or at least very much the liberal tradition, everyone thinks of the individual as a free spirit or able to make their own decisions. But within this institution, there is no freedom to decide. Okay. There is only freedom to follow.
I've just thought of what I put as the new division between individualism and what was the other part?
Institution.
Institution. Individualism is, of course, the individual making their choice, but institutionalism is how much you allow them to make that choice. So with the officers, for example, Colonel Black goes on an anti-communist drive at one point, and he's just allowed to continue with this. And put this perspective, he, trying to discredit Major, makes everyone sign allegiance at every single point, even if they have to get their rations from the stores, or even if they have to eat in the canteen, they have to sign this allegiance. And it's just showing bureaucracy to a ridiculous level. And this is how one individual can allow themselves to become an individual, which is allowed at senior ranks. And when institution getting involved is when someone of a senior rank uses their individualism. So basically, individualism is allowed the more senior you get. The more junior you're out,
this is where I would disagree with this, because I would say that, as we touched on before, the colonels, for example, were just chasing hierarchy. And it was the institution that was forcing them to slide up this slippery slope. And in fact, their decision-making was completely narrated by the institution that they're in, and not about their own individualism. Because their individualism wouldn't just... There was more inclinations in themselves than just to slide up.
No. Oh, sorry, Luke.
I was going to agree with Elliot that I disagree with you, but for different reasons. So for me, every character in this is running counterintuitive to the institutional ideals, even at the more senior end, even at the more junior end. So you have, obviously, Yossarian, who's not following the military protocol, what's expected of him in a patriotic sense either, or what is expected of him in a religious sense, but he's expressing his own individualism. That's the obvious one. But then you get to other characters as well. Colonel Cathcart, the institution of the military wants to reward men for promotion based on their military successes. Colonel Cathcart is trying to manipulate that system for his own individual benefit. He's trying to play the institution against himself. And the same in a different way for the chaplain. The chaplain is defying the institution of religion by seeing the hypocrisy in the way religion is used and the kind of almost insignificance religion holds. And so for me, in a way, even though you could feel like institutionalism has this overarching control, every character within it is defying the institutional expectations. They're expressing their individualism to the ninth degree. And ultimately, in many ways, a lot of them maybe don't get what they want, but they're also not punished by this kind of hegemonic, controlling beast that you'd call an institution or an overarching ideology.
Yeah, everyone's trying to play the system.
Everyone's trying to play the system, and so I think, again, maybe there's a very clever element to the book that you could look at it as the absolute power of bureaucracy, of government, of military, which all fits into the notion of the institution, but actually each individual character maintains and persists with individual expression in their own ways.
Yeah, I feel with this again, it goes back to what makes an institution. It's made up of enterprise of individuals. And I think when you always analyse society, you give it this kind of fictional head that society is led in this one way, or bureaucracy is led in a certain way. But I think what Heller does brilliantly is actually he illustrates how individuals curate and formulate a bureaucracy, and there is no linear abstract notion of what the bureaucracy is derived from. It's a formulation of loads of ideas presented by people who can't actually implement those ideas. So they might have good notions of, we need to win this war, but when you actually give it to the individual of such a simple message, they go into so many different abstractions, and it becomes this unwieldy, non-concise madness, and you just get you get individuals being put to the fore of that.
Okay, let me give you a basic example of this. So, the Institution is the guidebook that Captain Scheifskopf uses to guide his troops on how to march. And then he interprets it a certain way, and that is as the individual. So the Institution is just a set of rules, but the reality is everyone as individuals is interpreting these in different ways and exploiting it.
Yeah, or exploiting it, or condone. Like they can either do both ways. They either exploit it or they actually endorse it.
What comes to mind for me is, so there's a book by Joseph Conrad called Secret Agent, and within that book, the secret agent, the titular character, meets a bomb maker who talks to him about his countercultural views. The secret agent wants to destroy society, he wants revolution, he wants things to change drastically, and the bomb maker explains to him that in order to feel so adverse to society, you need to be part of it to begin with. And I think that feeds into this in a way. Every individual who is trying to counter the institution is obviously part of the institution, and the institution itself has a self-perpetuating hypocrisy about it as well. There's a part where Yossarian is marching around with his gun on backwards and I think his top's off in the most ludicrous fashion, back and forth, and they talk about how he's jeopardizing our notions of freedom and independence by expressing freedom and independence.
Luke, this brings me on to my final question, and this is with Yossarian. Do you think he's ever faking his insanity towards the second half of the book? So what you're talking about there was him walking around naked with his gun on the back of his, the gun behind him. And there's a couple of occasions where he gets naked after missions. Do you think he's faking it in order to try and get himself out?
I don't think he's ever faking it. I think that's the general repercussion of... So, giving a bit of backstory to Yossarian, the time and the moment is so important.
Sorry, you've also got to explain what Catch-22 is, because none of us have done that yet.
So let me just give to your question. About the moment that you're discussing when he turns insane, it features this very prominent moment, which you have Snowden, who's
new pilot.
Who's a new pilot in the war effort, and they're going over to do a mission, and they get in a particularly precarious scenario, and Yossarian at the start of the scene is wrapping his leg because it's been hit by a bullet, and completes the wrap, and it seems to be ending on a positive. And then Yossarian looks at his shirt and then takes his shirt off, and Snowden's guts and everything in his body falls out into Yossarian's arms. And I think that's such a poignant moment, because you've got to put yourself into the shoes of this character. You've been heroic, you've been patriotic, you've done everything that the bureaucracy has told you to, and then you have such a horrendous, disgusting moment of just where somebody who's your friend, a new person, a new member to this war institution, and they are bleeding out and their guts are falling into your arms. And I think for me that's the question, is it that moment that makes you insane, or was it your own insanity?
I think that is the pivotal moment that changes Yossarian's perception of the war and what he's doing. It's when his paranoia starts. It's when his fear of death really becomes a lot more poignant. And I think it's important to mention as well, out of all the events and characters in the book that Heller has said he drew upon real life experiences for, a lot of them are very tenuous. Yossarian's apparently kind of pick and mix of different people he met during the war. He himself enjoyed his war experience. Some of it is from stories he heard from other airmen, but apparently the death of Snowden was from personal experience. So I think there's a lot of individual investment there from Heller in terms of the serious impact that had on Yossarian's mental state and his perception
on anybody's mental state. How for us in peaceful times, I don't think any of us can fathom having a friend or even just a personal acquaintance.
That's what I was just telling Matthew about. So
I know Heller. This is the only experience in the book where Heller is synonymous with his own personal experience.
The reason I say this is when Yossarian first goes into the military, the reason he chooses to be a bombardier is it's got one of the longest periods of training, and his theory is it's got a 6-month, 1-year training, and by that time the war will basically be over. And so he's always trying to get himself out of the war, even before.
Do we know? See, I always think that there's that moment that Yossarian just switches, and so before this he was patriotic, he was a massive believer, and then everything after that he's become a different being. So every reason that he initially got into the war has now been fragmented or changed into why he originally got into it. Because if you were presented into that your own circumstance, why did you draft yourself into a war? And then you realise how horrific it was. You would always look at the reasons why. Well, this was my only option. This was the actual reason. I think it's almost backward logic.
When was he a patriot in the beginning of the book?
He was heroic. He did a double. So his first bombing mission didn't succeed, and so he went back, bombed the bridge again, even though there would been double the amount of flak.
It's why he got made a captain. It was because of that.
But don't you think that was just so they wouldn't do that mission again?
No, I disagree. I think the death of Snowden was a fracture point for him between the viewpoint and person he was before and the person he became. And I think what's really difficult or challenging about trying to discern whether he was insane or sane or what end of the spectrum he was on, and what makes it really nebulous is he can never really live up to the insanity around him. No matter how insane he actually potentially is, the insanity around him, by contrast, just normalizes him in many ways. Even at the beginning, we know Orr is obviously pretending, but talking about the crab apples and the conkers in the mouth, and every situation he comes across is so absurd that there's no reference point to judge his insanity.
But even just taking Orr as an example, Orr has pretended to be absurd in order to fit in with the bunch of absolute maniacs that were presented. You've got Hungry Joe, who's just the craziest character. His little camera that he takes out every time he sees a naked woman. It's just so farcical.
Well, one of the funny paradoxes I find about Hungry Joe is Hungry Joe is always having these nightmares where she's screaming about, death and those sort of things. But when he is about to do a mission, he doesn't have these nightmares. It's only when he thinks he's about to get off those missions and he's done his quota that the nightmares return.
Well, I almost think that the nightmares are more about what he's actually done during the war. I think this is my view on it, was it was the killings and the horrific acts that bombers would do. I mean, you've only got to think of Dresden, where in a single night they lit up 300,000 people. Also, maybe it's less, but I think it was around that number. And I think if you were taking that as an individual, and you realised how many people, how many kids, how many children you'd incinerated in your one mission.
Yeah, so when your mind's on the mission, you're okay, but when you actually take a step back to think about it, that's where the nightmares come.
Yeah. I think if you look at Vietnam War, that probably 100%.
Absolutely.
I mean, we speak about this not having any idea what it's like to be in a war scenario.
Yeah, we're so alienated from the plethora of emotions you probably feel being a soldier.
I mean, the closest we come is Call of Duty, where you've got infinite lives. You're literally about your kill to death ratio. There is,
which for me is not good. Which makes me emotional.
In fact, when your teammates die around you, you start shouting at them.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's a very different thing nowadays.
God forbid if millennials have to ever go to war.
Yeah.
You died?
Yeah, where's my respawn?
Yeah.
That should be that's definitely on my tomb. Where's my respawn?
Where's the space bar?
Yeah. Okay, I think that draws us nicely to a conclusion of tonight's discussion. So I think that really we've got to end up just rating this book. I think we decided that we would each do a 1 to 10 review, and then we'd put ours together, and then we'd be able to catalogue both our book and our whiskey going forward.
So should I start off? So the book is it's quite a tricky one because I'm trying to put it in relative position to the others we've read. But I think due to its innovative nature, I've never read a book like it. I've never come across a book with the humorous circular logic, the circular reasoning, the very poignant points about life, about war, about the absurdity of the world we live in that pervades every facet of our existence. I think I've got to rate it 9 out of 10.
I don't think I can go as far to give it a 9. I think for its individuality, I think that's the characteristic that you really have to congratulate this book for, because for somebody, especially your first book, I couldn't even imagine being as brave as Hella was to think, this is my first time novel, I'm really going to not write a short book, I'm going to write a 550 page book, include all these characters. I think that's well, if it's not genius, it's something, it's a special characteristic. The only thing for me personally, and this is genius side, I felt it was a bit too convoluted. I know that's the style, and I know but for me to get to a 9 or an 8, I think it isn't what I'm after specifically in a book. So I think this book is a perfect category for me to give it a 7.
I'm exactly the same. 7. It was a good book. I enjoyed a lot of the conversations. I found it funny. But for me, the book was far too long. You could have axed a hell of a lot of the characters, had a lot of the underlying meanings still go through the books, and still be as poignant. And for that reason, 7.
Okay, now we move on to the whiskey of tonight. Matthew, do you want to kick us off?
I'm going for a 6 out of 10. Very easy drink whiskey, but for me, nothing special.
I would completely agree. The exact points Matthew's made. Easy to drink, but very undefined. Nothing special about it.
I think we, for one time, all agree.
I'm going to change my vote.
6.1. Okay, well, wow, I think that's the first time we've ever agreed. Au revoir. Good night.